From Washington, I'm David Schultz, and this is Talking Tax. We're only halfway through this week, and we've already got a lot of news about what the future of IRS leadership will look like. Not only is the Senate Finance Committee scheduled to vote on two important nominees this week, one at the IRS and the other at Treasury, the White House also announced it would be creating a new position, the IRS CEO, and naming to that position the current commissioner of the Social Security Administration. Of course, one piece of news that we still don't have is who will get nominated to be the next permanent IRS commissioner, a job that has seen numerous figures cycle in and out throughout this year. To make sense of all of this, we rang up Pete Sepp, president of the nonprofit group National Taxpayers Union. He spoke to Bloomberg tax reporter Chris Chaffee about what exactly an IRS CEO would do and what he thought when he found out we'd be getting one.
The first thing I did was hearken back to the history of the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998. That legislation was born out of recommendations of a commission on which NTU's executive vice president served. One of the original concepts of that commission was to have a board of directors for the IRS that would have hiring and firing authority over the commissioner. And that was kind of like a CEO model being proposed for IRS. Now, the ultimate legislation did not include that kind of structure. What it had instead was an IRS oversight board. No hiring and firing authority over the commissioner, obviously, but it was supposed to provide detailed and pretty much obligatory guidance to the IRS over its strategic plan. Maybe this CEO hiring is a sign that Treasury is considering having a more accountable model for management of the organization. Congress, of course, is right to ask a number of questions here. How does this position interact with that of commissioner? What kind of taxpayer privacy concerns get raised? Will there be, in fact, nominees for the IRS Oversight Board? The structure is still there. It's just been dormant because neither the White House nor Congress for the past 15 years or so have bothered to participate in the nomination process. So a lot of questions to unpack here, and we should ask them because the management of the IRS and the overall administration of the tax code is at stake here. Frankly, amateur night is over. We have to figure out, going forward, how professionals, through Secretary Bessent and others, are really going to take hold of the IRS bureaucracy and shape it in a way that works for taxpayers.
I'm glad you brought up the Oversight Board because it's something that, exists, I guess, but it is not stood up. And so that must be a concern for you as someone who's kind of really thought about these issues in depth.
Yeah, this isn't just a concern, it's a frustration. And I can tell you, virtually every time I have testified before Congress for about 10 years now, usually once a year, sometimes every other year, I have brought up the dormant IRS Oversight Board and the fact that my organization lobbied to have an oversight board. And most of the time, I get the eye rolls among members of Congress and their staff saying, yeah, we know it's dormant. Well, if you know that, let's have a frank discussion about its future. Is there a need, for example, to improve how the Oversight Board nomination process works? That was proposed, actually, by Senator Cardin and Senator Portman, both of them just before they retired. That would be an ideal discussion to have, especially since the Senate Finance Committee has that Taxpayer Assistance and Service draft before it right now. I mean, if there ever were a vehicle to add some clarification on the Oversight Board to, that's the legislation for it.
There is historical examples that we can come up with where a leader of one agency also leads another. However, in this context, we're talking about Social Security and IRS, and there has been some questions around privacy when it comes to sharing of taxpayer information with other agencies, including law enforcement. And so what I'm curious about is what's your concerns? What do you think this means for taxpayer privacy to have this IRS CEO, especially one who at the Social Security Administration has shown a willingness to work with law enforcement to share information?
Well, there are practical reasons for having concerns. I know these have been expressed on other panels I've been on about how the difference of information that you have with tax records versus other kinds of records containing personally identifiable information might not mesh well for some of the law enforcement purposes that the administration is thinking of. You can use all kinds of various names, for example, on a tax return that might not be the same names you're looking at in, entry-exit records that the Customs Service might have. And you could get a lot of false positives. So you have to have a system in place that can intercept all of that and sort the information out. There's also the concern, of course, about whether the information that gets shared is sufficiently secured. The IRS does not have necessarily an unblemished track record here of keeping information safe. It has an even worse track record when taxpayer identity theft occurs. We are still looking at a resolution time on average of ID theft cases involving tax of a little under a year. That's just abysmal when you consider that in many cases in the private sector, a credit card company sets a benchmark of resolving the whole thing in under a month. So those are challenges. If you were to try and look on the bright side of this, you would say, well, who better to understand the necessity of safeguarding private information and dealing with identity theft problems and whatnot than somebody from the Social Security Administration? Others who are critics of the White House might say, well, this is not an ideal track record that we're walking into here, and we're going to want to ask some serious questions. I think serious questions need to be asked as long as, again, they're serious. What so many of these exchanges between Democrats in Congress and the White House break down to are floor speeches and sound bites. What we need is an honest, technical level discussion about how this information is going to be protected, how it's going to flow. I think that we are well past the point of politics here, and we have to get into genuine tax administration questions.
It's Tuesday when we're recording this. We do expect Wednesday Senate lawmakers to advance two nominees out of the Senate Finance Committee and to the Senate floor for official confirmation votes to move a Deputy Secretary of the Treasury in Derek Tyre and Don Korb, who is the IRS Chief Counsel nominee. What's your take on those jobs? We actually saw this morning that Derek Tyre already has been elevated to be Deputy Treasury Secretary. How do you feel generally about the importance of having Senate confirmed people at these agencies to do these roles?
Well, first I should say Derek Tyre and Donald Korb are two very sophisticated, smart individuals who would do a good job in tax administration functions. I think it's all the more critical to get folks like that in place, regardless of the political ideologies that are always clashing here, because right now, and I took a look at this just a week ago when one of my colleagues handed it to me. There's an organizational chart at IRS with 29 of the most important posts: the commissioner, the deputy commissioners, and whatnot, taxpayer advocate. Out of those 29, as of last week, only 10 had been filled by permanent people. The rest were either vacant or occupied by acting people. That is not a way to chart a permanent policy course, especially if you want to change that course. And see, that's why it's very important to have that continuity of leadership at the top. People who are going to settle into the job and not necessarily get comfortable with it, but rather understand the levers that are going to have to be pulled, pushed, or whatever to get a different charted course in administrative policy, taxpayer rights, customer service, all of it. If you have people who are just acting, who have not been asked good questions by the Senate, if you have people who are doing several jobs at once, they may not be able to devote their full attention to what's going on. And you have to take into account the reaction from workers that are lower down in the hierarchy. Are they wondering, is my department so unimportant that we can't have a permanent head of it? Still others with more nefarious intentions might say, well, I'll just wait this person out until the administration is over, and then we can go back to business as usual. We don't want that in the IRS. We can't afford it in the IRS.
Yeah, and to your point, I think anybody who has started a new job, you're not really good at your job on the first day. It takes a while. So, having those people that may not be staying long or, having the positions vacant, that must make it difficult to do some of that long-term work.
And I would just add, too, that the confirmation process is important, but again, there are so many questions that need to be asked and answered nowadays that really aren't necessarily achieved through many confirmation hearings. They break down along partisan lines, and you don't get into necessarily the important technical details of the job. I mean, Donald Korb's hearing is instructive in a number of ways as to how he would approach his job, but we had a whole list of questions that we published on our website that were highly specific in nature. For example, how would he approach the backlog of cases in tax court? There's roughly 2,500 cases involving either captive insurance or conservation easements. There's no way they can possibly be litigated in either of our lifetimes to a satisfactory conclusion. Is he going to use global settlement initiatives to try and clear those dockets off? We deserve to hear detailed views on how a chief counsel nominee would approach those issues.
Do you believe that it is important to have a Senate-confirmed IRS commissioner, or do you think an IRS CEO can be sufficient to lead the agency?
If Congress determines that a CEO-style model is better for the IRS than a commissioner-style model, then they can legislate it, and they should. In fact, we've often argued that having a CEO chosen by some kind of board of directors would be worth considering for the IRS. Now, if you're going to have a CEO alongside a commissioner, maybe there needs to be some clarification of the duties of that CEO. The more I read about this selection, the more I think it's like a COO, a chief operating officer, than a chief executive officer. If that's the aim of Secretary Bessent, more power to him, because the IRS does need some kind of executive leadership to hold all the others in that leadership tier accountable for actually meeting milestones. So what we need here is more clarity from both branches, more of their own oversight functions from both branches.
That was Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union, speaking with Bloomberg tax reporter Chris Chaffee.